She kissed a criminal to escape the man who broken her heart. And then everything falls apart. Have you ever made a decision in 3 seconds and spent 3 years paying the price for it? Evelyn Vale did. A kiss, and a stranger. A name that silenced all of New York when mentioned. This is the story of a woman smart enough to throw the perfect party, but crazy enough to fall in love with the most dangerous man in the city. If you stay until the end, hit like and comment your city name below, so I know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The night Evelyn Vale unraveled was a Tuesday in September, and it smelled like champagne and fresh-cut peonies, and the particular kind of expensive perfume that Manhattan women wear when they're trying to look like they don't care how they look. She had designed every inch of the Meridian Gala herself. The centerpieces, 47 arrangements of white peonies and eucalyptus, each one positioned at exactly the angle she'd tested twice in her studio. The lighting, warm gold at 70% brightness, low enough for flattery, high enough that the Kellerman Foundation's donors could read their checkbooks without squinting. The string quartet tucked into the northeast corner of the grand ballroom at the Callaway Hotel, playing Debussy at a volume calibrated not to intrude on conversation, but to fill the silences between money and obligation. This was what Evelyn did. She built beautiful things under pressure and made them look effortless. She had been doing it since she was 24 years old, running courier errands for an event firm that didn't know what to do with a girl who color-coded her anxieties into spreadsheets and never, not once, missed a deadline. That was 9 years ago. Now her firm, Vale and Associates, handled 12 major events annually, employed 6 full-time coordinators, and had a wait list so long that Evelyn had stopped returning calls from clients who didn't have a referral. She was good at control. She was exceptional at distance. And she was 3 glasses of Sancerre into what should have been an unremarkable professional evening when she looked up from her clipboard and saw Adrian Cross moving through the crowd toward her like water finding the lowest point in a room. Her stomach didn't drop. It was worse than that. It simply stopped. Like a clock someone had reached into and grabbed the hands of. She stood very still beside the floral installation near the east entrance and did what she always did when something threatened to breach the perimeter she kept around herself. She assessed. 7 months. That was how long it had been since Adrian sat across from her at a restaurant she'd made a reservation at, ordered his usual, the halibut, sparkling water, no dessert, and told her, with the same emotional register he used for conference calls, that he didn't think their engagement was working anymore. He'd laid out his reasons with the calm, unhurried logic of a man who had made his decision some weeks prior and was now simply delivering the paperwork. There was no cruelty in it. That was the thing she could never quite explain to her friends or her sister or the therapist she'd seen for 6 weeks before stopping. There was no cruelty, just absence. A clean, sterile nothing where 2 years of her life used to be. She had not cried until she was in the elevator going down. She had not broken down until she was in the cab. She had not told anyone the full truth of how bad it was, because the full truth was that she'd handed someone all the pieces she kept hidden, and he'd handed them back without even understanding what they were. And now here he was. At her gala. In a charcoal Brioni suit she'd helped him pick out at the beginning of their relationship, before she understood that he collected beautiful things the way other people collected experiences, because they were useful, not because they mattered. He spotted her at the same moment she spotted him. His face arranged itself into that practiced warmth, the smile that had fooled her for 2 full years into thinking she was seeing something real behind it. He was already raising his hand in a small wave, already pivoting in her direction, already owning the air between them. Evelyn had perhaps 4 seconds before he reached her. She felt it in her chest first. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific panic of a person who has rebuilt themselves carefully, deliberately, brick by brick, standing in front of the one thing capable of kicking the whole structure down just by existing. She was not over him. She had not been over him. She had been surviving him, which was a different thing entirely. And she'd been doing it by keeping her perimeter intact and her schedule full and her heart in a locked room she didn't visit after dark. She had 3 seconds now. Her eyes moved, not with panic, but with the trained reflexes of someone who'd spent a decade reading rooms, and landed on the man standing 7 feet to her left. I was tall. Not aggressively tall, but the kind of tall that makes other men near him adjust their posture without realizing it. Dark suit, no tie, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and the kind of stillness about him that you noticed before you noticed anything else. Like he'd arrived in this room and decided it would come to him if it needed anything. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at nothing in particular, holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and she had the fleeting impression of a man who came to events like this the way other men went to the dentist. Necessary, tolerable, something to be completed and departed from efficiently. 2 seconds. Evelyn made the worst decision of her life. She stepped to him, put her left hand on his forearm. She felt him tense immediately, a coiled reaction that told her without any ambiguity that this was not a man who was touched without permission. And before she could finish the thought she'd started, she reached up with her other hand, hooked 2 fingers into his collar, and kissed him. Not a brush, not a suggestion. She kissed him full and deliberate, with the specific concentration of someone making a point rather than making a pass, and for exactly 4 seconds the entire east side of the grand ballroom seemed to hold its breath. She pulled back. He was looking at her, silver gray eyes. That was the first thing she registered when the blood stopped rushing so loudly through her head, silver gray and completely, utterly unreadable. The kind of eyes that had looked at worse things than an impulsive woman grabbing him at a charity gala and had not flinched at any of them. He didn't move, didn't step back, didn't make a sound. Behind her she could feel Adrian's momentum stall, could feel him recalibrating, and she knew, in the specific way you know things about people who have studied you, that he wouldn't approach now. That was the calculus she'd made in 2 seconds without fully understanding it. Adrian Cross would not interrupt what looked, from the outside, like an intimate moment between a woman and a man whose body language said, "Do not." The stranger looked down at her. His expression hadn't shifted. Then he said very quietly, in a voice that was lower than she'd expected and carried no anger, only a kind of flat precision, "You just made a very dangerous choice." Evelyn held his gaze. Her pulse was a mess. Her hands were completely steady. "I know," she said. He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He turned his body slightly, a small shift that was also, unmistakably, a shield, positioning himself between her and the direction Adrian was standing without making it obvious he was doing it. "Your ex," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "He hurt you." Also not a question. "He didn't hit me," she said, because it was the thing she always felt she had to clarify. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him again. He was still watching her with that same unreadable attention, and she felt the strange, untethered sensation of being read accurately by someone who had no reason to try. "Yes," she said. "He hurt me." He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "Lucien Moretti," he said. She processed the name in real time, watched it move through her like a current finding ground. She knew the name. Everyone who moved in the overlapping circles of New York money and Manhattan influence knew the name, even if they said it differently around different people, carefully in some rooms, not at all in others. The Moretti Group. Hotels, shipping lanes, city contracts so large they restructured neighborhoods. The kind of wealth that had a gravity to it, a mass that bent the city slightly in its direction, and other things. The things that didn't appear in any filing and weren't discussed in daylight, and yet were somehow understood, collectively and without acknowledgement, the way a city understands its own fault lines without looking at the geological maps. "Evelyn Vale," she said. "I know," he said. She blinked. "You know who I am?" "You designed this evening." He looked around the room briefly, the peonies, the lighting, the string quartet, and then back at her. "It's good work." She had received a great deal of compliments about her work over the years. This was not delivered like a compliment. It was delivered like an observation from someone who'd been paying attention for reasons that had nothing to do with flattery. She didn't know what to say to that. That was unusual. "I should apologize," she said instead. "For the kiss." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not sorry." She opened her mouth, closed it. He was correct, and they both knew it. Something moved in his expression then, not a smile exactly, but a fractional shift at the corner of his mouth that might have been the geological precursor to one. "Stay close for the rest of the evening," he said. "I'll be nearby." It was not an offer. It wasn't phrased as one. It was simply stated the way someone states a fact about the weather or the time. Evelyn, who spent her professional life being the person who gave instructions, stood in her own event and felt, against every instinct she had, that arguing with this particular directive would be an exhausting waste of energy. She stayed close. She noticed things about him as the evening progressed. Small things, the kind that you accumulate without deciding to, the way you learn the layout of a new apartment without consciously trying. He didn't work the room. He stood near the perimeter of it, and the room worked around him, people drifting into his orbit and then back out, conversations initiated by others and concluded on his schedule. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, people didn't look away. His men were in the room too. She identified two of them within the hour, positioned with the specific, invisible attentiveness of people who had made a career of attentiveness. They didn't look at Lucian directly. They looked at everyone else. She understood, with a clarity that she hadn't been prepared for, that she had kissed a man whose security detail was watching the exits. Adrian had found her again, briefly, near the bar around 11 o'clock. He was all warmth and careful wording, doing the thing he did so well, making everything feel like a misunderstanding, like the problem had been a failure of communication rather than a failure of care. "You look incredible," he said. He meant it. That was the thing about Adrian. The things he said were true. They were just never the right true things. "Thank you for coming to support the Kellerman Foundation," she said. He paused at her tone, reading the distance in it. "Evelyn? I have to check on the dessert service," she said. "Enjoy the evening." She walked away from him for the second time in 7 months, and this time it was easier. Not painless, but easier. Some of that was the 4 months of therapy she'd actually used before the 6 weeks of the therapist she hadn't. Some of it was time. And some of it, she was honest enough with herself to admit this, was the fact that when she glanced across the room and met Lucien Moretti's eyes for exactly 2 seconds over the heads of 2 foundation board members, the warmth that moved through her chest was something she hadn't felt since before she understood what losing it cost. She did not examine that feeling closely. Not then. He found her at 20 minutes to midnight in the hallway outside the secondary service corridor, where she was standing with her clipboard and her earpiece, and the quiet, concentrated expression of someone tying off the loose ends of a 16-hour day. "The gala ends in 20 minutes, he said. 18, she corrected. He almost smiled again. She was learning to recognize the almost. "Have dinner with me," he said. "I have breakdown and vendor checkout starting at midnight. Tomorrow." She looked at him. The hallway was empty and lit with the warm spillover from the ballroom, and in it he looked somehow more himself than he had in the crowd. Less contained, not dangerous exactly, but with something closer to actual attention focused entirely on her. And it was a different thing than being noticed. She had been noticed her whole professional life. This was being regarded. "You said I made a dangerous choice," she said. "You did. Having dinner with you seems like making another one." "It is," he said, without any hesitation. She looked at him for a long moment. The clipboard was in her hands. Her earpiece crackled quietly with one of her coordinators doing a final vendor count. She had a car coming at 12:45. She had a 7 a.m. call with a client in Boston. She had a morning that would begin with 2 shots of espresso and a color-coded production brief, and would leave no room in it for whatever this was or what it might become. 7:30, she said. "I don't do late dinners on weeknights. I'll have a car at your office at 7:15. She didn't ask how he knew where her office was. She was fairly certain she already understood the answer to that, and she was fairly certain that answering it honestly would require a longer conversation than she had 18 minutes for. "Good night, Mr. Moretti," she said. "Lucien," he said. She walked back into the ballroom. She didn't look back, but she felt him watching until the door swung shut between them, and she did not, quite, manage to suppress the small, involuntary thing that happened in her chest at that chub. She told herself that night, lying in her apartment on the 14th floor of a building in the West Village with the windows open and the city making its endless, indifferent noise below, that she was going to cancel. She rehearsed the text in her head 3 times. Polite. Professional. "Thank you for being kind at the gala. Something has come up." She did not send it. She told herself it was curiosity. Professional curiosity. Even Lucien Moretti's foundation work was publicly documented, his charitable contributions to urban development well publicized. And there was nothing inherently reckless about having dinner with a man whose legitimate holdings were worth 11 figures. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. She was going because when he'd said "I'll be nearby," and positioned himself between her and pain without making a performance of it, something in her that had been braced against impact for 7 months had, without her permission, partially exhaled. She hadn't been held. Nothing like that. Not even close. But she had been, for the first time since she could remember, considered. And the particular hunger she'd discovered in the months since Adrian had handed her feelings back to her like misplaced luggage was not, she was learning, a hunger for companionship or comfort. It was a hunger to be seen by someone who was actually looking. His car was there at 7:14. Of course it was. She'd spent a completely unreasonable amount of time selecting what to wear, which she resented. Not the time exactly, but the fact that she cared because caring meant vulnerability. And vulnerability had a cost she was still in the process of calculating. She settled on a midnight blue dress she'd had for 3 years, simple and cut well, because she believed in not announcing effort even when she was making it. The driver, who introduced himself as Thomas and did not offer any further details, took her to an address in the meatpacking district that she did not recognize. No signage on the building, a single black door set slightly recessed into an unmarked brick facade. Steps leading down. Below street level, the restaurant was a thing she had never seen described anywhere. 12 tables, dark wood and candlelight. A wine cellar built into the exposed stone wall. A kitchen she could hear but not see. The maitre d' met her at the bottom of the stairs with the particular composure of someone accustomed to unusual arrangements, and guided her to the only occupied table in the room. Lucien was already seated. He stood when she arrived. She noted this without making much of it, but she noted it, and waited until she was settled before he sat back down. "There's no menu," she observed. "They cook what's good tonight," he said. "I'll tell them if you have preferences." "I don't eat pork." He nodded once. That was apparently sufficient. "You shut down an entire restaurant," she said. "I own the building. They were closed tonight anyway." She looked around at the 12 empty tables, the full wine cellar, the candles burning in a room specifically arranged for one conversation, and she thought, this man does not do things by half. "That's an unusual amount of effort for a first dinner," she said. "I don't like being interrupted," he said. It was so simple and so completely himself. She was learning, already, in the span of this first full conversation, that Lucien Moretti said the actual reason for things, rather than the socially acceptable adjacent version of the actual reason, and it was deeply, disorientingly refreshing. "Most men," she said, "would have said something like, 'I wanted the evening to be special.'" "That's true too," he said, "but it's not the first reason." She looked at him across the table. Candlelight did things to his face that the ballroom lighting hadn't, showed the lines around his eyes that were either from squinting in sunlight or from a specific kind of sustained, effortful tension, she couldn't yet tell which, showed the slight unevenness of a jaw that had been, she thought, broken at some point and healed slightly off. He was not conventionally handsome in the way Adrian had been. Adrian, who'd had the easy symmetry of a man designed for the surface of things. Lucien looked like a face that had made its way through actual time. She found she preferred it. "Ask me the question you've been working up to since yesterday," he said. She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Your family's history with—" "Say it plainly," he said. She met his eyes. "The Moretti Group's history with organized crime." He didn't move, didn't change expression. "What do you want to know?" "Whether it's past tense." "It's in the process of becoming past tense," he said. "That process is ongoing. It is taking longer than I intended, and it is more dangerous than I had anticipated. Both of those things are true." She absorbed this. Most people, she had learned, responded to directness with deflection, with charm or explanation, or the well-practiced performance of reasonableness. He responded to directness with more directness. It was, she realized, the most intimate thing she'd experienced in months. "You're not going to tell me you're not dangerous," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said. "Not about anything, and particularly not about that." The first course arrived then, a small bowl of something with saffron and a bread she didn't recognize that turned out to be extraordinary. And she looked at it, and then at the man across from her and thought, "You are exactly what you said you were at the gala." She had made a dangerous choice. She was making another one right now. And the thing was, the true, terrifying, completely unreasonable thing, she was not afraid. She was awake, for the first time in 7 months, in the specific way you feel awake when something is demanding your full, unmediated attention, and everything in you rises to meet it. They stayed for 4 hours. She learned He had grown up in a household where power was the primary language and silence was used as a weapon. He had two siblings, a younger brother named Daniel, a doctor working in underfunded community clinics in the Bronx, and an older sister named Mara, who had removed herself from the family entirely 12 years ago and was never discussed. He had taken over the Moretti Empire at 28, 6 days after his father's stroke, without any preparation, any warning, or any choice that he could see clearly enough to make. He had spent the years since trying to locate an exit from the inherited architecture of violence that would not collapse the structure on the people inside it before he could get them out. He did not make this sound heroic. He made it sound like construction work in bad weather. She told him things too. Not everything. She wasn't built for everything at once, but things she hadn't said to anyone with quite that level of precision. That her career was her armor as much as it was her passion. That the control she exercised over events and details was partly aesthetic love and partly terror management. That Adrian hadn't broken her exactly, but he'd confirmed a fear she'd been carrying since her parents' marriage fell apart when she was 11. That she was the kind of person people practiced on before they found what they actually wanted. Lucian was quiet for a moment after she said that. That, he said, is someone else's failure projected onto you. I know that intellectually, she said. Knowing something intellectually, he said, is not the same as knowing it. She looked at him across the remnants of the fourth course and felt, absurdly, and despite every reasonable objection, that he was correct about nearly everything. Not in an omniscient way, not in the infuriating way of men who confused confidence with competence, but in the way of someone who had looked at the world from a position of power and danger long enough to have burned through most of the comfortable fictions. At midnight, she said she had to leave. He walked her up the stairs himself, which she had not expected. At the door, in the cold air of the meatpacking district with a light rain beginning to fall, he looked at her with those gray eyes that she was beginning to understand were the most honest thing about his face. I'll call you this week, he said. I have events Thursday and Saturday. Sunday, then. She nodded. Thomas was already pulling the car to the curb. Lucien, she said, and paused, assembling the things she needed to say. If this is going to be anything, whatever this is, I need you to not manage me. I don't mean the safety or the logistics. I mean the truth. I need the actual truth, even when it's bad. He looked at her for a long moment. The last person I told everything to, he said, was my brother. And even then, there are things I've protected him from. I'm not asking for everything, she said. I'm asking for enough. He considered this with the same quiet, unhurried attention he gave everything. I can give you enough, he said. Then call me Sunday. She got in the car. The rain was picking up. Through the window, she watched him standing outside the unmarked door, hands in his pockets, the slight evidence of that almost smile still in his face. And she thought, I have just agreed to step closer to a man who told me, within the first 30 seconds of knowing me, that I'd made a dangerous choice. And she thought, he was right. And she thought, I don't care. She faced forward and watched the city slide past in the rain, lit and indifferent and magnificent, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been locked up for 7 months doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. It was opening. She didn't stop it. She didn't have the first idea what was coming, what it would cost her, or what she would be asked to survive before any of this resolved into something she could hold without bleeding. What she knew, in the seat of a car in the rain, heading home through a city that neither of them controlled as much as they'd told themselves, was that she was more awake than she had been in years. And somewhere behind her, a man was still standing in the rain, still watching. The card was still on her desk Thursday morning when she came back from a site walkthrough, and she had not thrown it away, which told her more about her current state of mind than she was comfortable acknowledging. She'd held it for a long time Wednesday night, standing in her kitchen in socks and a t-shirt with a glass of water she hadn't drunk, turning the small white rectangle over in her fingers like it was a piece of evidence she hadn't decided how to categorize yet. The handwriting was clean, angular, left-leaning, someone who wrote the way they thought, she imagined, with economy and no wasted motion. Kangui dang teo zoi ban. Komfai toi. Someone is watching you, not me. She'd considered the possibilities in order. First, it was a manipulation tactic. The oldest one. Create the threat. Position yourself as the protector. Watch the target move closer. She'd read enough about the psychology of control to know the architecture of it, and she was not naive enough to rule it out. Second, it was true. And Lucienne had sent the warning because whatever she'd stepped into at the Callaway Hotel gala had peripheral consequences he'd already anticipated. Third, it was true, and he hadn't sent it at all, which meant someone else knew she'd had dinner with him 2 nights ago and wanted her to know they knew. None of the three options were comfortable. All three meant the same thing practically. She was already inside something, whether she'd agreed to be or not. She'd texted him at 7:15 Wednesday morning. The card on my desk. Yours? He'd replied 40 minutes later, which she suspected was fast for him. No. Don't touch the envelope again. I'll have someone pick it up. She'd stared at that for a while. I'll have someone pick it up, said with the same flat practicality with which another man might say, I'll grab coffee on the way. Like the infrastructure of surveillance and counter-surveillance was simply the administrative background of his daily life, a set of logistics no more remarkable than traffic. She had put the card in a Ziploc freezer bag she found in the kitchen drawer because she was not going to simply sit and do nothing, and she had gone back to work. Now it was Thursday, and she had a corporate dinner for 400 at the St. Regis in 9 hours, and a production timeline running on both her monitors, and she was sitting at her desk staring at the freezer bag like it owed her an explanation. Her assistant, a ferociously competent 26-year-old named Priya, knocked once and opened the door with the expression of someone who had already filtered 12 things before getting to the 13th. The florist is short on the white ranunculus. She's proposing ivory garden roses as substitute. Tell her the ivory gardens are fine, but I need them fully open, not tight, so she needs to pull from cold storage tonight, and I need a photograph of the arrangement by 6 a.m. Done. Priya clocked the Ziploc bag on the desk. Said nothing. She was exceptionally good at that. One more thing, Evelyn said. If anyone comes to the office today asking to pick something up on behalf of... She paused. She had not told Priya about any of this. She had not told anyone. Just call me before you hand anything to anyone. Priya's face remained professional and entirely without comment. Understood. The door closed. Evelyn put her eyes back on the production timeline. The numbers behaved. The schedule held. She spent the next 6 hours doing exactly what she was built for, managing 17 simultaneous moving parts with the specific focused attention of someone who used work the way other people used medication. And she did not think about Lucien Moretti. She thought about him constantly. His man came at 4:15. She knew before Priya called back that it was his. The build, the stillness, the economy of movement she was already beginning to recognize as a particular professional quality, like the practiced deliberateness of surgeons or bomb disposal technicians. He was perhaps 35, with a broad Slavic face and light eyes, and a way of standing in the middle of her reception area that made the room feel smaller without him doing anything visible to cause it. He introduced himself as Gavril, took the Ziploc bag with gloved hands, which she had not expected and which told her this was being treated with forensic seriousness. Said 3 words before leaving. Mr. Moretti calls tonight. She wanted to tell him she wasn't the kind of woman who waited for calls. She said, tell him after 9. Gavril nodded and left. Priya appeared in her doorway 30 seconds later with the expression of a woman who had a great many questions and the professional discipline not to ask any of them. The ranunculus florist confirmed the garden roses, she said. Good, Evelyn said. She went back to her timeline. He called at 9:12. She was in the car on the way back from the St. Regis, shoes off, feet tucked under her, jacket draped over the seat, the specific boneless exhaustion of someone who had just successfully run 400 people through a 4-course dinner without a single visible malfunction and was now privately collapsing. The dinner went well? He said when she answered. No preamble. How did you know I was at the St. Regis? A pause. Not long, but present. I know your calendar. She was quiet for a moment, watching the city scroll past outside the window. That's not something most people would admit. I told you I wouldn't lie to you. Knowing my calendar is not the same as telling me you know it. Fair, he said. And then, I know your calendar. I had your office checked after you started at Vale and Associates, because I like to know who operates at the level of events I attend. That was 2 years ago. I kept the monitoring active out of habit. She processed this. The city outside was all movement and light, indifferent as always. So you knew who I was at the gala? Yes. When you said you knew my work? Yes. She breathed in slowly through her nose. You let me think I'd surprised you. You did surprise me, he said. Not with who you were, with what you did. She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it and moved forward. The card, not from my people. The handwriting is being analyzed, but my initial assessment is that it came from within a rival organization. Someone who wanted you to know you'd been observed without wanting to identify themselves. It's a warning, not a threat. There's a difference. Explain the difference to me. A threat is specific. It tells you what happens if you continue. A warning is general. It's meant to produce anxiety without commitment. Whoever sent it wants you afraid and uncertain, not actually harmed. They're using you as a pressure point on me. She looked at the back of Thomas's head in the front seat. Thomas, who had driven her twice now, and who she was fairly certain was also reporting her movements somewhere. Are they going to escalate? I don't know yet. That's not reassuring. I'm not going to make it more reassuring by lying to you. What I can tell you is that you'll have someone on you starting tomorrow. You won't see them unless you need to. She felt the objection rise in her chest. Automatic, bristling. The reflex of a woman who had spent a decade building a life that was entirely on her own terms and did not include being watched for her own protection. I don't want a babysitter. What you want, he said, with a quietness that was not unkind but was entirely immovable, is not the variable I'm optimizing for right now. Lucien, Evelyn. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Someone put a card on your desk, in your locked office. That means they either have someone inside your building or they had access to it. That is not a small thing. I'm asking you to let me address it. You can be angry about it and still let me address it. She stared out the window. I was right. She hated that most. Fine, she said. But I want to know who it is. Name and description. I don't do well with invisible. Marcus, he said immediately. 41. Former military. He'll be in a gray Volvo on your block by 8 a.m. If you need him, you say the word green on the phone, to anyone. He'll come to you. She noted the preparedness of that. He'd had this ready before she agreed to it. You assumed I'd say yes. I assumed, he said, that you were intelligent enough to prioritize your own safety over your preference for independence. I was right. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, her building appeared around the corner. You're going to be a very difficult person to be involved with, she said. Another pause. This one different, shorter, warmer at the edges. Yes, he said. I know. Sunday, she said. Sunday, he confirmed. She hung up and sat in the stopped car outside her building for a moment, shoes still off, jacket still over the seat, the remnants of a 16-hour day settling into her bones. The city was loud and she was tired, and somewhere on her block there was a gray Volvo that hadn't been there before. She got out of the car. She did not feel afraid. She felt, inexplicably, like she was finally standing on solid ground, even though the ground was moving. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of her adult life, not because of Marcus and the gray Volvo, though she found that she stopped noticing him by the second week, in the specific way you stop noticing a recurring sound once you've identified its source. Not because of the phone calls, Sunday and Tuesday, and sometimes a brief one on Thursday when Lucien was between meetings in cities she didn't always know. Though those became the fixed points of her week with a speed that should have alarmed her, and instead felt like evidence of something she didn't yet have vocabulary for. What was strange was this. She was sleeping better. She hadn't told anyone that. It sounded insane even inside her own head, the logic of it. That proximity to a man who moved through a world of extortion and calculated violence and federal surveillance was producing in her the most uninterrupted sleep she'd had since before the Adrian disaster. But there it was. She fell asleep faster. She didn't lie awake cataloging the day's failures. The 4 a.m. anxiety that had visited her routinely for 7 months, sitting on her chest like a physical weight, and presenting its case for every way she was behind and insufficient and exhaustingly alone, it had stopped coming. She thought about why. She thought about it honestly, without flattery, the way she tried to think about most things. And what she arrived at was uncomfortable but true. For the first time in longer than she could account for, she was not the most vigilant person in her immediate world. Lucien had a kind of attentiveness that operated at a level she couldn't match and didn't need to match, and without deciding to, some unconscious part of her had simply put down the watch, trusted the perimeter. She did not like what that said about how exhausted she had actually been. She did not dislike it enough to change it. The second dinner was at his apartment, which occupied the top 2 floors of a building in Tribeca that looked unremarkable from the street and was arranged inside with the specific aesthetic of a man who understood that quality and display were two different things. No art chosen for investment value. Books on every surface, actual books, read ones, with creased spines and occasional passages underlined in pencil. A kitchen that had clearly been cooked in. Wide windows looking over a city that looked different from this high, quieter somehow. The noise filed down to something ambient and almost soft. He cooked. She had not expected that. He made something with short ribs that took 3 hours and required, at various points, his full attention and a glass of red wine. He drank slowly across the process, and he talked to her the whole time. Not constantly, not without pause, but in the specific way of someone who was genuinely interested in what she said and wanted enough silence between exchanges to actually think about it. She sat at the kitchen island and ate olive bread and told him about her parents' divorce, the mechanics of it, not the emotional fallout, not yet, but the logistics of what it looked like to be 11 years old and watch two people dismantle a household with the same detached efficiency they'd probably once used to build it. How her mother had color-coded the boxes. How her father had forwarded his mail before he finished moving out. How she'd started organizing her room obsessively that winter, building order in the 12-foot square she controlled because nothing else was controllable. Lucian listened without performing listening. He was reducing something on the stove, and he didn't stop to look at her with exaggerated sympathy, and he didn't offer a parallel story to redirect attention to himself. He just listened. Asked one question when she stopped. "What did you lose that you haven't gotten back?" She thought about it. "The assumption that things stay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't have that assumption to lose." She looked at him. He was stirring the short ribs with the focused, unhurried attention he gave everything, and he said it like a fact about himself rather than a bid for sympathy, which she appreciated more than she could easily explain. He wasn't asking her to feel sorry for what he'd grown up inside. He was simply accounting for himself. "Here are the materials I was built from. Here is what the structure looks like." "Is that why you're careful about what you commit to?" she asked. He looked at her over his shoulder. "I'm careful about everything." "That's not an answer." "Yes," he said. "It is why." The short ribs were extraordinary. She ate 2 portions without self-consciousness, which was its own kind of evidence that something in her was changing, and they stayed at his table until after midnight talking about nothing dangerous. Her worst event disaster. A corporate gala where a burst pipe had flooded 2 floors an hour before guests arrived, and she'd pivoted the entire event to the building's lobby with 40 minutes notice. His first solo international negotiation, 24 years old, Marseille, a shipping dispute he'd resolved by the simple expedient of understanding that the opposing party wanted to be treated with respect more than they wanted the money. The way New York looked different at 2 in the morning than it did at noon. The specific and irreplaceable quality of a city that was never actually quiet. She left at 12:30. He walked her to the elevator, not the door, small but noted, the distinction between watching her go and putting her in someone else's hands. In the elevator going down, she stood with her back against the polished wall and looked at her own reflection in the mirrored door and thought, "I am in serious trouble." She was smiling when she thought it. The trouble arrived, officially, 5 weeks later, at a place she'd call the Tuesday morning in a second-floor conference room she'd rented by the hour to prep a proposal, when Priya forwarded her a message from an account she didn't recognize. The message was 4 words. No signature. Ask him about Brennan. She sat with it for 2 full minutes. Then she called Lucien. He answered on the second ring. She read him the message without preamble. The silence that followed was 3 seconds, which from a man who never wasted words was a significant duration. "Where are you?" he said. "Conference room on 23rd. Why? Who's Brennan?" "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. Lucien, 10 minutes, Evelyn." And the line went dead. She put the phone down on the table and looked at the proposal materials spread across it. Venue layouts, catering estimates, lighting schematics, and felt the clean professional world of her work existence pressing against the other thing. The new thing. The thing she'd let get close enough to press back. He called back in 8 minutes. "Ray Brennan is a city councilman on 3 of my foundation's advisory boards. He's also been accepting payments from a subsidiary connected to my family's older operations. I've been managing his extraction from those ties for 2 years, quietly, Because if it becomes public, it implicates the foundations, and the foundations are the cleanest things I have. She absorbed this. Someone wants me to know about it. Someone wants me to know that they can reach you with information designed to make you distrust me. His voice was even, controlled. It's the same logic as the card. They're testing whether you're a vulnerability. Am I? Not if you trust me. I trust what I can verify, she said. Walk me through Brennan, all of it. Another pause. That's a longer conversation than a phone call. Then tonight. Tonight, he agreed. She hung up and sat in the conference room for a moment, looking at her proposal materials. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Because the work was here, and it was real, and it needed her. And falling apart in rented conference rooms at 10 in the morning was not something she was going to start doing now. But her hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. The Brennan explanation took 2 hours and a bottle of wine she barely drank, and the particular, stripped-back exhaustion of a man accounting fully for something he was not proud of. Not Brennan himself. The councilman was a secondary character in the story, a venal man in a system that rewarded venality, less interesting for his corruption than for what his corruption represented. The deep roots of the old empire reaching up through the legitimate ground Lucian had been trying to build on top of it. What she understood by the end of the 2 hours was something she hadn't fully grasped before. The process Lucian was trying to execute wasn't clean. It wasn't a redemption narrative with a clear before and after. It was daily, grinding, unglamorous work, identifying every connection, every leverage point, every person whose exposure would trigger a cascade of further exposure, and doing it without setting off the alarm systems of the people he was dismantling, who were not small and not passive and not slow. How long? She asked when he stopped. To complete it? 2, maybe 3 years if nothing accelerates. And if something accelerates? He looked at her across the table. In 2 months she had gotten better at reading the geography of his face, the subtle pressure changes that stood in for what other people expressed with larger movements. What she saw now was not fear. She didn't think he did fear the way most people did, but something honest and close to it. Then it gets loud, he said. She put her glass down. And dangerous. Yes. For people near you. He didn't look away. Yes. She'd known this. She'd known it from the first 30 seconds. But knowing a thing theoretically, and sitting across from it in real light, with a man who was looking at her like she was something he wasn't willing to categorize as expendable, those were different experiences. You should probably tell me to leave, she said. I'm not going to do that. Why? I was quiet for a moment. And then he said with the same simplicity he used for every true thing, because you're the only person in a very long time who's talked to me like I'm a person rather than a position. And I am, apparently, capable of being selfish about that. She looked at him. The apartment was quiet around them. Outside, 30 floors down, the city was making its unreachable noise. I'm not leaving, she said. I'm just telling you I know the terms. He nodded once, slowly. I know you do. It was 3 weeks after that when the world shifted in a way neither of them had quite anticipated, and it had nothing to do with anonymous messages or city councilmen or the patient, grinding work of dismantling an empire. It had to do with Adrian Cross. She'd run into him, not by design, not by his design either, as far as she could tell, at an industry dinner she couldn't avoid, seated 2 tables away by the particular cruelty of alphabetical placement. He'd looked across the room at her once. She'd looked back. And something in his face had rearranged itself in a way she hadn't seen before. Something that might have been, on a more emotionally available man, actual regret. She'd thought about it on the way home. She'd thought about it with the specific objectivity of someone who has had enough distance, to be honest. And what she'd arrived at was this. Adrian had not been a villain. He had been, in the most disappointing possible way, simply insufficient. He had never had the range for what she actually needed, and she had convinced herself for 2 years that what she needed was something smaller, because smaller felt safer, and safe felt like enough when you were tired. She called Lucian from the cab. I saw Adrian tonight, she said. I know, he said. There was the sound of him setting something down, clearing space for the conversation. How was it? She looked at the city going past. Smaller than I remembered, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. And something in the word, not triumph, nothing like that, just the low, even warmth of a man who had been patient about something for longer than he'd let show, made her close her eyes. Lucien, she said. Yes. I need you to say something true to me right now. She heard him breathe, heard the quality of his attention focus in the way it did, that particular gathering stillness. I have not, he said carefully, wanted anything for myself in a very long time. I want this. She sat with that. Okay, she said. Okay, he said back. She got home. She unlocked her apartment. She stood in her kitchen for a long time in the dark, not turning on the lights, feeling the city thrumming under her feet through the building's bones. And she made the decision that she'd probably been building toward since the night she'd grabbed a stranger by the collar and kissed him in front of half of Manhattan. She was in this. Whatever this was, however loud it got. She was in it. The morning it stopped being theoretical came on a Wednesday, 2 days later, without warning of any kind. She was at her desk at 8:40 when Priya opened the door with an expression she hadn't seen on her before. Not the filtered professionalism, not the efficient neutrality, but something beneath both of those, a tightness around the eyes that arrived before the words did. There's a man downstairs, Priya said. He says his name is Vittorio D'Angelo. He says he'd like 10 minutes with you. A pause. He says to tell you, no associates, no pressure, just coffee. Evelyn looked at the name and felt it move through her the way the name Moretti had moved through her at the gala, not with fear, but with recognition. The sound of consequence arriving at the address she'd given it. Vittorio D'Angelo. She knew enough now to know exactly who that was. She looked at her desk, at her timeline, at the work that needed doing and the day she'd planned and the clean, controlled professional world she'd built over 9 years. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a long moment. She did not call Lucien. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and said to Priya, "Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes." Priya's expression tightened further. "Miss Vale." 5 minutes, Evelyn said. "Then call Marcus and tell him green." She walked to the mirror behind her office door and looked at herself. Steady eyes, good posture, the face she put on for rooms that needed her to be the calmest person in them. Then she went downstairs to meet the man who had come to determine whether she was a weapon or a wound. She had every intention of being neither. The cafe Vittorio had chosen was 3 blocks from her office, a narrow place with exposed brick and small marble tables, and the kind of ambient noise that made it impossible to record a conversation clearly. She noted this the moment she walked in, and noted that he had chosen it for exactly that reason. He was already seated. Of course he was. Vittorio D'Angelo was 61 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years being consistently underestimated, which she suspected was a condition he had cultivated deliberately. Medium height, soft around the middle, silver hair combed back with the unhurried care of someone who had time for such things. His suit was good, but not aggressive about it. His hands, folded on the table around an espresso cup, were the hands of a man who had never needed to use them directly, and had always had other people for that. He stood when she approached, pulled out the chair across from him with a courtesy so practiced it had become indistinguishable from sincerity. "Miss Vale," he said. "Thank you." She sat, did not return the pleasantry. "You have 10 minutes. A small smile. Patient, like he'd been told that before. "I'll be brief." He gestured to the counter. "Coffee?" "No." He settled back into his chair with the ease of a man who had conducted 1,000 conversations in rooms like this, and had never once been the one who needed something badly enough to show it. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. "You're more composed than I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Most people are nervous when they sit across from me." "I'm aware of who you are," she said. "Awareness isn't the same as fear." The smile again, fractionally warmer. "Lucien chose well." "Lucien didn't choose me," she said. "We found each other. There's a difference." "Of course." He unfolded his hands and reached into his breast pocket. Slowly, with a deliberateness that was theatrical and meant to be. He wanted her watching his hands, wanted her prepared for what was coming so that her reaction would be visible. He placed a photograph on the table between them and slid it toward her. She looked at it. It was taken from an elevated angle, a security camera or a window above street level, she estimated, and it showed 2 figures outside an unmarked door in the meatpacking district, rain catching the light from a street lamp above them. Herself and Lucien. She was looking up at him. He had one hand slightly raised as if he'd just stopped himself from reaching for her. The timestamp in the corner read 3 weeks ago. She kept her face neutral, kept her breathing even. felt, underneath both of those things, the cold recognition of what this moment actually was. A man showing her that he'd had eyes on her since the beginning. That whatever safety she'd felt in Marcus and gray Volvos and encrypted burner phones had a ceiling she hadn't known about. "You're trying to determine whether I'm a vulnerability," she said. She kept her voice flat. "Whether Lucien has exposed himself through me." Vittorio tilted his head slightly, like a professor whose student had answered correctly but was still watching to see if she'd push further. "More specifically," he said, "I'm trying to determine whether you understand what you've walked into." "I understand it well enough." "Do you?" He picked up his espresso, drank, set it down. "What did he tell you about the federal arrangement?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't know. Lucien had told her about the long-term federal cooperation, the negotiations designed to dismantle the criminal operations in exchange for reduced exposure on the legitimate side. But because she wasn't going to hand Vittorio a confirmation of anything, he nodded, reading her silence accurately. "He told you. Good. Then you know he's been feeding information to prosecutors for—" He glanced briefly at the ceiling as if calculating, "approximately 14 months. You know the agreement involves full disclosure of the financial infrastructure, including third-party partners." He looked at her again. "You know that several of those third-party partners are not going to accept that disclosure calmly." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," he said. "I am giving you facts, Miss Vale. That is all I am here to do." He reached into his pocket again, same slow deliberateness, and placed a second item on the table. Not a photograph this time. A folded piece of paper. She didn't reach for it. "Names," he said. "People inside Lucien's organization who are aware of the federal arrangement and who are unhappy about it. People who will act on that unhappiness." He paused. "People who know exactly where you live." She looked at the paper, looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want Lucien to stop," he said, simply, without heat. "And I believe you are the most efficient path to that outcome. Not because you're controllable, you're clearly not, but because you're rational. And rational people, when properly informed, make rational decisions. You want me to talk him out of the federal cooperation. I want you to understand that if he continues, the damage will not be contained to him." He tapped the folded paper once with one finger. "Take it, read it, then make your own choice." He stood, buttoning his jacket with the same unhurried precision. "I have no interest in harming you, Miss Vale. I have significant interest in survival. Those two positions are, for the moment, compatible." He looked down at her from standing height, and his face had lost the warmth of the practiced courtesy. What was underneath it was not cruel. It was simply old, the face of a man who had made peace with the things he'd done and was no longer interested in performing regret about any of them. He can't protect you from what's already inside his house. He left. No goodbye. No theater of departure. He simply walked out the door and onto the street and was gone in the way of people who have mastered disappearing. Evelyn sat at the small marble table for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. She counted them, because counting was something she could control. Then she picked up the folded paper. Then she took out her phone and called Marcus directly for the first time. "I'm coming out the front," she said. "I need to go to Lucien. Now." She did not call Lucien first. She knew, with the specific instinct of someone who had been reading rooms for a decade, that this was a conversation that needed to happen face to face, with all the information in front of both of them, without the filtration of a phone line and the distance it gave both parties to manage their reactions before they had them. Marcus got her to Lucien's Tribeca building in 11 minutes. She rode the elevator up alone and knocked on the door, and when Lucien opened it, in a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, clearly in the middle of something, a phone in his left hand, she walked past him into the apartment and put the folded paper on his kitchen counter without a word. He looked at it, looked at her. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "Evelyn." "I just had coffee with Vittorio D'Angelo," she said. "I don't want to sit down." He went very still. The phone in his hand lowered slowly to his side. "You went." "I went." "I told you. You told me not to go, and I went anyway. And before you say anything else, I need you to read that paper, because what's on it changes the conversation we're about to have." He looked at her for a long moment. She met it. Her pulse was elevated. Not with fear, not exactly, but with the specific adrenaline clarity of someone who had just walked through something and was still running the inventory of what it had cost. He picked up the paper, unfolded it, read it. His face did not move. It never moved. But she was learning to read what stillness meant on him, and what she saw in the seconds he spent looking at that paper was not surprise. She registered that before she registered anything else. "You knew," she said. He folded the paper, set it down. "Lucien." "Two of those names," he said carefully, "I have been watching for 3 months. That's not what I asked. The third name—" He stopped. She waited. "The third name," he said, "I did not know. And that is a problem." She looked at the paper on the counter. 3 names. She hadn't recognized any of them. "Who is it?" He turned away from her, and the turning away, the first time she had ever seen him use physical space as a strategy in a conversation with her, told her more than whatever he was about to say. "His name is Connor Hale. He's been my head of financial operations for 6 years. She absorbed this. Inside your organization. Yes. Someone inside your organization knows about the federal arrangement. Yes. And Vittorio knows about it. Yes. She put both hands flat on his kitchen counter and looked at them, processing. The granite was cold. The city was loud outside, 30 floors down, doing its indifferent thing. How did Vittorio get that name? One of 2 ways, Lucien said. His voice had changed. Not louder, never louder, but with a density to it that she was learning was what controlled anger sounded like on a man who never let it run free. Either Vittorio has someone inside my organization who's been feeding him information, or Connor Hale went to Vittorio himself. Which is worse? He turned back to face her. The second one. She looked at him, because if Hale went to Vittorio voluntarily, the federal arrangement is already compromised. Yes. And the prosecution timeline could be in Vittorio's hands, or his lawyers, or both. He moved past her to the window, and she watched him stand there looking out at the city, and the set of his shoulders, the subtle, suppressed tension of it, was the most honest thing she'd seen him do in the 2.5 months she'd known him. "How bad is it?" she said. I was quiet long enough that she counted the seconds again. 7. If Hale has been feeding Vittorio information, he said, then everything I've built with the federal prosecutors over the past 14 months is a liability instead of an asset. The prosecution knows things about my organization. If Vittorio knows what the prosecution knows, he can either use it to preempt me, move assets, burn records, flip witnesses, or he can use it against me directly. Blackmail, exposure, leverage. He turned from the window. Or he can give it to the people on that list and let them use it however they want. She looked at the folded paper on the counter. The people on that list who know where I live. Yes. He said it without hedging. She had asked him for the truth and he had agreed to give her enough of it, and this was him holding to that. She straightened up from the counter. Her hands were steady. She made sure of it. What do you need to do? He looked at her. What? Right now, tonight. What needs to happen? Something moved in his face. Not surprise. She didn't think she could surprise him easily, not about practical things, but something more specific, a recalibration. I need to talk to Gavril. I need to find out what Hale has accessed in the last 3 months. And I need to contact the federal prosecutor's office to warn them that the arrangement may be compromised before someone else does it for me. Then do those things, she said. I'll be here. He looked at her for a long moment. You should go home. I'm not leaving you alone with this tonight. Evelyn, I'm not asking for your permission, she said. I'm telling you where I'm going to be. Go make your calls. He held her gaze. She held his. He nodded once and took his phone to the far end of the apartment, and she stood in his kitchen and listened to the low, controlled sound of his voice from the other room, and made herself a glass of water and drank it, standing at the window, looking at the city below. She was afraid. She was honest enough to name it, even if only to herself, standing alone with 30 floors of Manhattan between her and the ground. Not the sharp adrenaline fear of immediate threat. The slower, colder fear of someone who has just understood the actual dimensions of what they've walked into and is measuring themselves against it, and not yet certain of the outcome. She finished the water. She was still there when he came back. The next 72 hours were the most informative of her life, and not in a way she had wanted. Connor Hale was unreachable by the following morning. His apartment in Murray Hill was empty, not recently vacated, but cleared out systematically, the kind of departure that takes planning, not panic. His access credentials to the Moretti financial systems had been used for the last time 4 days prior, which meant he'd known something was coming and had positioned himself before it arrived. Gavril delivered this information in Lucien's conference room at 7 a.m. with the flat, effectless delivery of a man reporting weather rather than betrayal. And Evelyn sat across the table and watched Lucien receive it with that terrible stillness of his and understood something new. The stillness was not calm. It had never been calm. It was the specific, sustained muscular effort of a man holding an enormous amount of force in check by sheer will, and the effort of it was visible. If you knew where to look, in the jaw, the hands, the quality of breath. She knew where to look now. He took the secondary ledgers, Gavril said, digital copies. The originals are secured, but the copies exist and we can't verify where they've gone. Who else knew he had access to the secondary ledgers? Lucien said. 3 people. All of them have been with you since before the transition. I want each of them in a room with you by noon. Done. And I want Hale found, not approached. Found. Gavril nodded and left. The conference room was quiet. Outside the glass wall, 2 other members of Lucien's core team were working at their stations, and neither of them looked up, and Evelyn noted their particular quality of focused in curiosity. The practiced absorption of people who had learned that not seeing things was a survival skill. The secondary ledgers, she said, document every transaction from the older operations that I haven't yet disclosed to the federal prosecutors. He said it without inflection. Every payment, every name, every political arrangement, every structural decision that predates the transition. Meaning, if Vittorio has them, he has everything I've spent 3 years trying to extract myself from in a form that can be handed directly to a prosecutor or a journalist or anyone else who knows what to do with it. She looked at the table surface. Mahogany, or something meant to look like it. Or used as blackmail. Yes. He wouldn't want to expose you, she said, working through it. Exposure ends the leverage. He wants to hold it over you, force you to stop cooperating with the federal prosecution, maybe pull back the legitimate restructuring. Return to the old arrangement, Lucien said, where everyone stayed inside the same system and nobody moved without permission. His voice had the tone of a sentence being completed, not a new thought beginning. She looked at him. He wants the empire intact because the empire protects him too. Vittorio's operations run through 6 legitimate businesses that are technically subsidiaries of Moretti Group infrastructure. If I dismantle the criminal architecture cleanly, those subsidiaries lose their laundering channels. He paused. I've known this for 2 years. I've been building the exit route slowly enough that he couldn't react before it was complete. Hale just handed him the alarm. She absorbed this. All of it. The whole structure of it. The years of careful architecture and the single point of failure and the way it had unraveled not with violence but with a man quietly copying files and walking out a door. What happens now? She said. He looked at her and for the first time she saw something she hadn't seen on him before. Not fear, still not quite that, but the thin edge of something that in another context she might have called lost. Like a man who has run every calculation and arrived at a result that requires something he hasn't built yet. I need to move faster than I planned, he said. How much faster? Months? Maybe weeks? She stared at him. The federal prosecutors, are they still? I spoke to them last night. They're holding, but they need me to deliver the financial disclosures before Hale surfaces with the ledgers and frames the narrative himself. If he goes to Vittorio's lawyers first, everything I've spent 3 years building reads as a criminal trying to preempt exposure rather than a cooperating witness voluntarily restructuring. She understood. The difference is who tells the story first. Yes. She stood up. What do you need from me? He looked at her like he was still getting used to that question, to someone asking it and meaning the operational version of it rather than the emotional. Nothing right now. I need you away from this building and somewhere you can't be easily reached. I'm not going into hiding, not hiding, just away from the immediate radius. His jaw tightened fractionally. I need to make several decisions in the next 48 hours that I cannot make clearly if I am simultaneously calculating your exposure. She opened her mouth. He looked at her, and something in the look was not a command. It wasn't the immovable directive of a man used to being obeyed, but a request. The particular costly vulnerability of someone who is admitting that another person's safety is more important to them than their own convenience. She closed her mouth. Where? She said. I have a place in Connecticut. Gavril's wife is there with her sister. It's clean, no connection to anything current. He paused. Take Priya. Priya doesn't know. Tell her there's a security situation with a client. She's smart enough to stop asking questions when the questions get dangerous. He moved toward her, and she stood her ground. And he stopped 3 feet away and looked at her with those silver-gray eyes that were the most honest thing about his face. I need you safe so I can think. That is the entire reason. There is no other reason. She held his gaze. 48 hours. Possibly 72. You call me. Every 12 hours. Yes. And you don't make any irreversible decisions without telling me first. He was quiet for half a second. Some decisions may need to be... Lucienne. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, and she didn't soften it. You told me you wouldn't manage me. That means I'm a person in this, not a variable you protect and then present with outcomes. You tell me before you do something you can't undo. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, not yielding exactly, because she'd understood by now that yielding wasn't in his vocabulary, but acknowledging. The look of a man making an actual commitment rather than a tactical concession. Before anything irreversible, he said. She nodded, picked up her bag, stopped at the conference room door and looked back at him. Find Hale, she said. Yes. And when you do... She stopped. She had opinions about what should happen then. She understood that her opinions existed in the space between the world she'd lived in and the world he navigated, and that the distance between those two worlds was not something that could be crossed by the right phrasing. Just find him. She left. The Connecticut house was a white colonial on 3 acres outside Westport, clean-lined and quiet, surrounded by the particular deep autumn stillness of deciduous trees at the end of October. Gavril's wife, a compact, watchful woman named Elena, who made very good coffee and asked very few questions, gave Evelyn and Priya the 2 rooms on the second floor and fed them dinner at 7 without comment. Priya had asked 2 questions on the drive up and then stopped, which was one of the qualities Evelyn valued most in her. She worked remotely from the dining room table. Evelyn did the same. They processed vendor confirmations and production briefs and a new proposal request from a client in Boston, and the normalcy of it was its own kind of medication. Lucian called at 9 p.m. the first night. We have Hale's location. Connecticut, she said, because she'd been thinking, and the thinking had arrived somewhere. He's in Connecticut. A pause. How did you... If he ran and he wanted to stay close enough to be useful to Vittorio but far enough to be safe, and if he knows your operation well enough to know which cities you have active infrastructure in, he avoids New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Connecticut is the gap. 3 seconds of quiet. New Haven, he said. She closed her eyes briefly. Is he safe? For now, he's just being watched. Don't do anything to him. Evelyn, I mean it. Don't touch him. She heard her own voice, the flatness of it, the specific register of a woman who is no longer making requests. If you hurt him, and it comes out, and it will come out, Lucian, everything comes out eventually. It destroys every piece of the federal cooperation. You become exactly what Vittorio wants you to look like. Silence. The ledgers, she said. Does he have them on him? We believe so. Encrypted drive. Then you don't need to touch him. You need to talk to your federal contact and tell them exactly where he is and let them pick him up. Let the legal machinery do it. It's slower, but it doesn't leave blood on the cooperation agreement. More silence. Longer this time. You've been thinking about this since you left this morning, he said. I've been thinking about this since the cafe yesterday, she said. She heard him breathe. I'll call Reyes tonight. A pause. The federal contact. Good. You'd have made a very effective... He stopped. What? Nothing. But the ghost of that almost smile was in his voice, and she felt it across 90 miles of Connecticut darkness like a hand placed carefully over hers. 12 hours, she said. Call me. 12 hours. The call at 9 a.m. the next morning did not come from Lucian. It came from a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't answer it, and then she did because not answering felt like the wrong kind of caution. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Measured, professional, with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to saying significant things in a short amount of time. Miss Vale, My name is Sandra Reyes. I'm the assistant U.S. attorney on the Moretti cooperation matter. Lucian asked me to call you. Evelyn sat up straighter. Is he all right? He's fine. He asked me to reach you directly because there's a development he thought you should hear from me rather than him. A pause. Brief, professional. We picked up Connor Hale at 6:40 this morning at a motel in New Haven. He had the encrypted drives. He also had another pause, this one slightly different in quality. He had a conversation recorded on his personal phone, a phone call made 11 days ago. Evelyn waited. The call was between Hale and a third party discussing the specifics of the federal cooperation arrangement, the timeline, the key disclosures, the protection terms. Reyes's voice stayed level. Miss Vale, the call also includes a discussion of you, specifically your address, your schedule, and a proposal to use you as leverage if Lucian attempted to accelerate the cooperation timeline. The room was very quiet. Outside the Connecticut window, a bird moved through the bare branches of a maple tree. Evelyn watched it. How long has Hale been feeding information out, she said. Based on the drive contents, 18 months. She did the math. 18 months. 4 months before she had ever met Lucian, before the gala, before any of this. He was already compromised before I was ever involved. Yes, which means Vittorio knew about the federal cooperation long before the card on my desk, long before the cafe meeting. Everything Vittorio did, the card, the meeting, the paper with the names, it was performance. He already had everything. That's our assessment, Reyes said. The cafe meeting was about determining whether you were a stabilizing influence on Lucian or a destabilizing one, whether you'd push him toward caution or toward acceleration. Evelyn stood up from the edge of the bed, moved to the window, the maple tree. The bird was gone. And what did he decide? We don't know yet. A pause. Miss Vale, I'm telling you this because Lucian was very clear that you were to have full information. He also asked me to tell you, Reyes seemed to choose the next words deliberately, that he intends to move forward, full acceleration, complete disclosure to our office within the next 14 days. He says to tell you he's made an irreversible decision and is informing you before it executes. He'd remembered. She had asked him, in a conference room 36 hours ago, to tell her before anything irreversible. He'd remembered. She pressed the back of one hand briefly against her mouth. Then she lowered it. Tell him I understand, she said. I'll tell him. And tell him... She stopped. The right words were not the words she would normally use. Not in this context, not on a federal attorney's recorded line. Tell him Green, she said. A brief pause from Reyes. I'll pass that along. The call ended. Evelyn stood at the window of the Connecticut house with the phone in her hand and the maple tree outside and the particular clarifying silence of a moment after which nothing will be the same. 14 days. Full disclosure. The entire machinery of the federal prosecution accelerating toward detonation while Vittorio D'Angelo sat somewhere in this city holding secondary ledgers he thought were going to save him. She thought about what that meant. The exposure. The cascade of it. Every name, every account, every arrangement, including the people on that list who knew where she lived, who were now going to watch their protection evaporate in real time. She thought about what it meant for Lucian, what it would cost him. Not just the empire. She understood by now that he'd been willing to lose the empire for years, that the empire was a structure he'd been born into rather than built, and that its loss was a price he'd long since calculated. What it would cost him was the years, the slow, careful work. The version of this that ended cleanly, with minimal damage, with the people inside his organization extracted safely before the building came down. That version was gone. What was left was faster and louder and would leave marks on everyone it touched. She turned from the window. Priya was in the hallway. She'd been quiet, professionally invisible, but the quality of her stillness near the door said she'd understood from context that the morning had changed shape. Evelyn looked at her assistant, 26 years old, ferociously competent, entirely trustworthy, and owed an explanation that Evelyn was not sure she could give fully and not sure she could withhold entirely. We're going back to the city, she said. Priya didn't hesitate. I'll get the car, Priya. She stopped her, chose the words. What I'm about to walk back into. I need you to know it's not a client security issue. It's more complicated, and I need you to decide whether you want to keep working for me knowing that, or whether you want to take the next 2 weeks as paid leave and let me handle this alone. Priya looked at her. Then she said, with the flat certainty of someone who has already made the calculation, "I'll get the car." She walked down the hallway. Evelyn stood in the quiet of the upstairs room for one more moment. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, standing in her event with a clipboard and an earpiece, and Adrian Cross cutting through the crowd toward her with that practiced smile. She thought about 3 seconds and a bad decision. She thought about what it had cost and what it had given her, and she understood, with the cold, clear precision that had always been her most reliable tool, that the accounting wasn't finished, not close. She picked up her bag, she went downstairs, and in a motel room in New Haven that morning, Connor Hale had given federal prosecutors 18 months of betrayal on an encrypted drive. But what no one yet knew, what Evelyn would not discover until she walked back into Lucian's Tribeca apartment 4 hours later and found him standing at his conference room window with Gavril and 2 men she didn't recognize, and an expression on his face that she had never seen before and would not easily forget, was that the encrypted drive contained one thing beyond the secondary ledgers, beyond the recorded phone calls, beyond every piece of evidence that could be used against Vittorio D'Angelo. It contained the name of the federal prosecutor's informant inside the Moretti organization, not Hale. Someone who had been there longer. Someone Lucian had trusted completely. Someone whose name, when Evelyn finally read it on the document, Gavril slid across the conference room table, made the room go sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the floor and everything to do with the specific, devastating geometry of a betrayal that had been in place before she existed, before the gala, before any of this, and which meant that everything Lucian had built, every careful year of it, had been watched from the inside by someone who loved him. The name on the document was Daniel Moretti, his brother. The name sat in the middle of the conference room table, like something that had fallen from a great height and hadn't finished the damage yet. Daniel Moretti. Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked up at Lucian. I was standing at the window with his back to the room, and she could not see his face, which was the first time in 4 months that his face had been unavailable to her, and the absence of it told her more than any expression could have. His hands were at his sides. Not fisted, just present, motionless, with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped all voluntary movement because the involuntary ones are the dangerous ones right now. Gavril was watching him the way you watch a structure you're not sure will hold. The 2 men she didn't recognize, federal, she understood, from their bearing and the quality of their silence, were looking at the table with the specific incuriosity of people trained to be present in rooms like this without creating additional pressure in them. Evelyn looked at the document again. The name, the dates beside it. The first date was 19 months ago, which was 1 month after Lucian had begun his federal cooperation in earnest, which meant Daniel had known about the arrangement almost from the beginning. The last date was 11 days ago, which was 4 days before the card appeared on her desk. She thought about what Lucian had told her about his brother. Daniel, the doctor, the one who escaped, the one working in underfunded community clinics in the Bronx, the one who had removed himself from the family empire with enough completeness that Lucian referred to him, every time, with something in his voice that was the closest thing to uncomplicated love she'd ever heard from him. The one person he'd said he'd told everything to. The one person he'd protected from the worst of it. The one person who had apparently been feeding that protection directly to federal prosecutors for 19 months. Lucien, she said. He didn't turn around. Lucien. Harder. Not a request. He turned. His face was... She searched for the word and couldn't find a sufficient one. Composed the way a demolished building is composed, after the dust settles. All the structure still present in outline, but the interior gone. Tell me what you know, she said. To him, not to the federal men, not to Gavril. To him. He came to the table, sat down in the chair across from her, which put the document between them on the table's surface. And he looked at it the way you look at something you're making yourself look at, rather than something you want to see. Daniel approached the U.S. Attorney's office 19 months ago, he said. His voice was level, each word placed deliberately, like bricks. He initiated contact independently. He was not solicited. He provided documentation, records he had access to because I gave him access to them. Because I was explaining the financial restructuring to him, and I wanted his input on the medical foundation components. He stopped. I trusted him with the architecture because I trusted him completely. Evelyn kept her eyes on him. Did he know he was compromising you? Yes. No hesitation, no soft. The documentation he provided directly implicated my operations. It's what allowed the federal case to be built in the first place. He picked up the document and put it face down. Without Daniel's records, the federal prosecution has significantly less. With them, he stopped again. With them, they had leverage over you, she said. Yes, and the arrangement you thought you were building voluntarily was substantially less voluntary than I understood. The room was very quiet. One of the federal men shifted in his chair. Gavril had not moved. She breathed in through her nose. Out, organized the logic of it. Why would Daniel do it? Lucien looked at the table surface, at the space where the document had been. Because he's been trying to get out from under the family name for 12 years. Because every legitimate thing he's built, the clinics, the funding, the community work, is contaminated by association with the Moretti name, as long as the Moretti name means what it means. His jaw tightened. Because he decided that the cleanest way to guarantee I couldn't go back to the old operations, even if I changed my mind, was to make sure the federal case existed, to make the exit mandatory. What? He didn't trust you to do it yourself. Silence. Lucien. No, he said. He didn't trust me to do it myself. She sat with that. The specific compound wound of it. Not just the betrayal, but the reason for it, which was not malice and not greed, but a kind of desperate fraternal lack of faith. His brother had looked at him and had not believed that he was capable of choosing this without being forced to. She thought about what that cost, layered on top of what it actually was. Where's Daniel now? She said. One of the federal men spoke for the first time. Protective custody, as of this morning. His cooperation agreement with our office was formalized 9 months ago. He has immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Evelyn looked at the man. He's protected. Within the terms of his agreement, yes. She looked back at Lucien. He was looking at the table. So he's safe. He's safe, Lucien said, and the word safe came out of him like something he'd had to push past an obstruction. She stood up, walked to the window where he'd been standing and looked out at the city. The same city, 30 floors down, roaring with its permanent indifference. She put one hand flat on the glass and felt the cold of it. What happens now? She said. Not to the room. To him. He came to stand beside her, not close enough to touch, close enough to be present in the specific way he was always present, with the full weight of his attention, which she had learned was not a small thing. Now we accelerate, he said quietly. Everything Vittorio thought he had as leverage, the secondary ledgers Hale copied. Daniel's records made those redundant to the federal case 9 months ago. Vittorio doesn't know that yet. He thinks the drives Hale had are the critical piece. They're not. He paused. Which means we have a window. How long? Hours. Maybe a day, before Vittorio's lawyers finish analyzing what was on Hale's drives and realize the federal case doesn't depend on them. She turned from the window. Then we move now, Shad. What followed was not the violent confrontation she'd half prepared herself for. It was worse than that, in the specific way that bureaucratic machinery moving at speed is worse than violence. More irreversible, more comprehensive, touching more surfaces with more permanence. Lucien spent the next 6 hours on calls she was not part of, in the conference room with the federal men and Gavril and 2 attorneys who arrived within 40 minutes. And she sat in his kitchen with her laptop and her phone and did something that surprised her in its usefulness. She worked. Not her own work, though Priya, installed at the kitchen island beside her, was handling the operational threads of Vale and Associates with the quiet, complete competence of someone who had made peace with the strangeness of the day. Evelyn worked on what Lucien was doing. She pulled every public record she could find on the Moretti Group's legitimate holdings, studied the board structures, the foundation charters, the charitable partnerships. She built, in a document she labeled framework because she didn't have a better word yet, a picture of what the legitimate architecture looked like, stripped of the criminal infrastructure beneath it. She had managed complex events for 9 years. At their core, every event was the same problem. You had an ideal outcome, you had current conditions, and you had to build the bridge between them in real time while the conditions kept changing. The Moretti Group's restructuring was a larger version of the same problem. The ideal outcome was a fully legitimate operation that survived the exposure of the criminal foundation without collapsing. The current conditions were chaos. The bridge was made of legal frameworks and public narrative, and the specific, careful order in which things were disclosed. She knew how to build bridges under pressure. At 3 in the afternoon, she knocked on the conference room door and opened it. Lucien looked up from the table, which was covered in documents she didn't have clearance for, and his expression when he saw her, the specific, involuntary quality of the thing that moved in his face when she appeared, was something she filed carefully and didn't examine until later. The Kellerman Foundation, she said. It's the cleanest board on the legitimate side. If you're going to issue a public statement about the restructuring, it should come first from Kellerman's executive director, not from you. You distance the legitimate charitable work from the announcement before the announcement happens, and you do it in the next, she checked her watch, 4 hours, before whatever Vittorio is planning has time to frame the story first. One of the federal attorneys looked at her. Who is this? She's with me, Lucien said. Flat, unqualified, final. The attorney looked at the documents on the table, then back at Evelyn. This is an active federal. She stays, Lucien said. The attorney looked at his colleague, then at Lucien. Then he moved on, because there were apparently things in Lucien's voice that federal attorneys also recognized as not worth contesting. Evelyn put her laptop on the table and opened the framework document. The call from Gavril came at 7:46 p.m. She was in the kitchen eating something Elena had sent up from the building staff kitchen. She couldn't have said what it was, only that it was warm and she needed it. When Lucien came out of the conference room and the quality of his movement told her before he said anything that the thing they'd been bracing for had arrived. Vittorio moved, he said. What did he do? He didn't do it himself. He had someone do it. He sat down across from her at the kitchen island, and she registered that he was sitting down, which meant he needed to be sitting down, which meant it was bad. Daniel, he said. Her stomach dropped. He touched Daniel. They took him from the federal safe house 20 minutes ago. The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the ventilation system of the building and the distant, permanent noise of the city and her own pulse, which had moved into the higher register. It went to when something required her to be fully present, and she had approximately no warning. How? She said. Someone inside the safe house protocol. We don't know who yet. His voice was even, each word still placed deliberately. But she could hear it now. The cost of the evenness, the specific muscular effort of a man keeping himself at operational capacity when what was happening was not operational. It was personal in the most fundamental way a thing can be personal. Is he hurt? We don't know. She put down the fork. Vittorio wants you to stop the disclosure. Trade Daniel's safety for the federal cooperation. Yes. Has he made contact? Not directly. He'll wait until we've had enough time to understand what's happened. He looked at her. He's giving me tonight to consider my options. She looked at his face, the lines of it, the specific, sustained exhaustion of a man who has been holding enormous force in check for years and is now being handed the one thing capable of making that force feel irrelevant, his brother. The person he had protected and trusted and been failed by and loved without modification through all of it. She reached across the counter and put her hand over his. He looked at it, then at her. Tell me what you're thinking right now, she said. I was quiet for a long moment. I'm thinking about going to get him myself. And then? And then I'm thinking about what I would do to the people who took him. She kept her hand where it was. Is that the plan? No. He turned his hand over slowly, so their palms were together. It's what's in the way of the plan. What's the plan? I don't have one yet. He said it with the flatness of someone who is admitting a thing they are not accustomed to admitting. I've been running plans for 3 years and they've all just... He stopped. His hand tightened fractionally on hers. I need to think. Think out loud, she said. He looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said. And you think better when someone's listening. You've told me that, even if you didn't use those words. So think out loud and I'll tell you when something doesn't hold. He breathed. One long, controlled intake and release that was the most visible piece of genuine effort she'd ever seen from him. If I respond with force, he said, I give Vittorio the version of this he wants. Lucien Moretti engaging in retaliatory violence, which he can use to undermine the federal cooperation, position me as acting in bad faith, and take the narrative. He paused. If I comply with what he's asking, Dietz, stop the cooperation, pull back the disclosure. I buy Daniel's safety and lose everything else. 3 years, the federal arrangement, the legitimacy of everything I've built. Neither of those, she said. No. So there's a third option. There has to be. She took her hand back. Not withdrawal, she needed both hands to think. She stood up and walked to the window, the same window she'd stood at twice now, and looked at the city below, and thought. The problem was the same one it always was. Vittorio had leverage. The leverage was a person. To remove the leverage, you remove the person from Vittorio's control. To do that without violence, which was off the table because violence played into Vittorio's hands, you had to make Vittorio release the person voluntarily. And the only thing that made Vittorio release Daniel voluntarily was the thing Vittorio wanted. The federal cooperation stopped. Unless Vittorio's calculation changed. Unless the cost of holding Daniel became greater than the benefit of the leverage. She turned around. The disclosure, she said. What's the timeline if you accelerate it maximally? Not 14 days. Not 48 hours. Tonight. Lucian looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, but the recalibration she'd learned to recognize. If I release the full disclosure to the federal prosecutors tonight, all remaining documentation, every account, every name, the prosecution can move on Vittorio's operation by morning. He worked through it as he said it. She could hear him building the logic in real time. Which means anything Vittorio does to Daniel after that is retaliatory and unprotected, she said. If the leverage is already gone, using it doesn't benefit him. It only adds criminal exposure. He's not rational under pressure. He is, she said. That's exactly what he is. He's rational under pressure. Everything he's done has been rational. The card, the cafe meeting, Hale, Daniel, every piece of it was calculated. She moved back to the island, which means if you move faster than he can recalculate, he doesn't have a play. Lucian was very still. The disclosure happens tonight, she said. You get ahead of every piece of it. You don't give him the window to reframe the story because you give him no window at all. By the time he understands that the leverage is gone, you've already burned down everything he was protecting. And Daniel becomes liability the moment the leverage is gone. Vittorio lets him go because holding him is now pure exposure with no benefit. Silence. Long. She waited in it. If the calculation is wrong, he started. Then we deal with what's next, she said. But it's not wrong. You know it's not wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. At the woman standing in his kitchen who had been pulled into his world by 3 seconds and a kiss and had, at every point since, refused to be a variable and insisted on being a person, and who was now standing in the wreckage of his most careful plan and proposing something faster and more complete and more dangerous than anything he'd built. He stood up. Gavril, he said. Gavril appeared from the hallway. The man was apparently always exactly far enough away not to intrude and exactly close enough to respond immediately, which Evelyn suspected was the defining professional quality of his existence. Get me Reyes on the line, all remaining documentation, tonight. Gavril nodded. Gone. Lucian looked at Evelyn. If this goes wrong, it won't. Evelyn, it won't, she said. Go. He went. She did not sleep. Priya did eventually, on the couch in the living room, her laptop still open on the cushion beside her, which Evelyn found unexpectedly moving in a way she didn't examine closely. She covered her with the blanket from the back of the couch and went back to her position at the kitchen island and watched the city outside the window and listened to the low contained activity from the conference room and tracked the time. 11 p.m. The federal filing began. Midnight. Lucian came out briefly, took coffee from the carafe she'd made, said 3 words. Reyes has everything, and went back. 1 a.m., Gavril came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway. Miss Vale? She looked at him. Mr. Moretti wanted me to tell you. The prosecutors have moved to seal Vittorio's primary accounts. It's beginning. She nodded. Daniel? No contact yet. Okay. He left. 2 a.m. She was still at the window. The city below was quieter. Not quiet, never quiet, but in the register it reached between 2 and 4 in the morning when even New York paused to breathe. She was thinking about Daniel, about the fact that he'd done what he'd done because he didn't believe his brother could choose this alone. About the terrible, wasteful irony of it, that Lucien had been choosing this painstakingly for 3 years, and the person who loved him most had not been able to see it. She thought about what it cost to be chosen by someone and not know it. To wait so long for proof of something that was already happening, invisible, behind the curtain of a man's careful silence. She understood that. She understood it more than she was comfortable with. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it. Miss Vale. A voice she hadn't heard before. Male, measured, with the specific flat calm of someone who makes calls like this routinely. I represent certain interests currently inconvenienced by the evening's federal activity. We'd like to speak with Mr. Moretti. She kept her voice level. He's unavailable. We have something he wants returned. Her pulse. The high register again. Put Daniel on. A pause. Then a sound. Movement. The quality of a phone being handed. And then a voice she recognized from photographs and descriptions, and the tone Lucian used when he spoke about him. Slightly younger, slightly softer, currently compressed with a strain it was trying not to show. I'm all right, Daniel said. Don't stop. Don't stop what you're doing. The line went back to the measured voice. You'd like Lucian to stop the disclosure, Evelyn said. It's already done. Everything is already with federal prosecutors. It's been filed, sealed. There's nothing left to stop. She kept her voice completely even. What you're holding is no longer leverage. What you're holding is a kidnapping charge. I'd suggest you reassess quickly. A long pause. You have 1 hour, she said. After that, the location of this call gets run by people who have resources I'm not going to describe to you. Return him. She paused. That's not a negotiation. She hung up. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the counter and pressed down until they stopped. She picked up her phone and called Gavril. They called me, she said when he answered. Trace the number. Already running, he said, which meant he'd been watching her phone. She decided she didn't have feelings about that right now. Miss Vale, what did you say to them? The truth, she said. A pause. Does Mr. Moretti know you? Tell him now, she said. She put the phone down. She breathed. She looked out at the city and thought about a woman she used to be 4 months ago, standing in a ballroom of her own making with a clipboard and an earpiece and every variable controlled. And she tried to locate the distance between that woman and the one standing in this kitchen at 2 a.m, having just told a man working for a crime lord that the leverage was gone. The distance was very large. She was not sure she would have gone back across it, even if she could. Lucian came out of the conference room at 2:23 a.m. and looked at her across the kitchen, and she saw in his face that Gavril had told him. You answered their call, he said. Yes. You told them the filing was complete. Yes. He crossed the kitchen in the specific, contained way. He moved when something had broken through the control. Not fast, but with the compressed energy of it visible in every step. He stopped in front of her and she met it, standing her ground the way she'd learned to. Not because she wasn't affected, but because she understood that yielding would cost them both something neither could afford. Evelyn. Her name in his voice at that register, low, stripped of everything except the thing underneath, was something she felt in her chest rather than heard. If they had decided that losing the leverage was reason to, they didn't. But if they had, Lucien. She put her hand on his face. Flat palm, her fingers at his temple. The way you touch something you're checking is real. He went absolutely still. I made a calculation. It was the right one. If it had been wrong, we would have dealt with it. She looked at him steadily. I don't make decisions I haven't thought through. You know that. He covered her hand with his, held it there. Daniel, he started. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She reached back without moving away from him and picked it up. Unknown number again. She answered. Put it on speaker. Address, said the measured voice. No preamble. An address in Queens, across street she didn't know. Then the line went dead. She looked at Lucian. His hand was still over hers. His eyes were on the phone. Then he moved, and the controlled speed of it. The absolute contained urgency of a man who has had everything stripped back to one essential thing was the most human she had ever seen him. Gavril, he said, already moving toward the door. Queens. And then he stopped. Turned back. Looked at her across the kitchen, the distance of the room between them, with something in his face that she hadn't seen before and wouldn't have had words for even if she had. The specific, uncalculated look of a man who has just understood that the thing he's most afraid to lose is not the thing he thought it was. Come with me, he said. Not an instruction, not a directive, a request. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She went with him. The address in Queens was a warehouse on a street so ordinary it was almost an insult. Cinder block, corrugated metal overhead doors, the kind of building that exists in every outer borough and contains everything from restaurant supplies to commercial laundry and, apparently, tonight, one frightened doctor being returned by people who had just lost their only reason to keep him. Lucien was out of the car before it stopped completely. Evelyn was 3 steps behind him, and she kept those 3 steps. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood that what was about to happen was his. The reunion of it, the wreckage of it, the complicated compound thing between 2 brothers that she had no business inserting herself into. Daniel was sitting on the warehouse floor just inside the overhead door, which had been raised and left open, with his jacket gone and a cut above his left eye that had stopped bleeding some hours ago by the look of it. He was alone. Whoever had been here and was now not here, which was either a message or a mercy, and she suspected it was both. Lucien stopped in front of him. Daniel looked up. His face was... She looked away because the thing on Daniel Moretti's face when he saw his brother was not something she was meant to see. Not yet. Not tonight. It was private in the way of things that have been a long time in the building and a long time unspoken. She turned toward the street, stood with her back to them, listened to the city, which out here in Queens was a different sound, wider, less dense, more room between the noises. She heard Lucien say his brother's name, once. She heard the sound that Daniel made in response. She could not have described it. She did not try. She kept her back turned and looked at the street and thought about the disclosure going live in prosecutors' offices across the city, about Vittorio D'Angelo's accounts being sealed while he slept or didn't sleep, about the secondary ledgers that Hale had copied and that Vittorio had thought were his weapon, rendered redundant by a doctor's quiet betrayal that turned out to be, in the ugliest possible way, an act of desperate faith. She thought about what Lucien had said 3 months ago, at the hidden restaurant on their first dinner. If you stay near me long enough, someone will eventually try to use you against me. She had stayed, and they had tried. And she was standing outside a warehouse in Queens at 3 a.m, with the city spread around her and the sound of 2 brothers at her back. And what she felt in her chest was not the aftermath of fear. It was something so much harder to name and so much harder to lose. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Lucien appeared at her shoulder. She turned to look at him, at the exhaustion on his face, the genuine stripped-down fatigue of a man who has spent 3 years and the longest night of his life arriving at a single point. And she held his gaze and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that wouldn't be smaller than the silence. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with the specific, unhurried gentleness of someone who is not performing anything. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Reyes. He answered it. She watched his face as he listened, watched the information arrive and move through him, watched the specific fractional change in his expression that told her, before he said a word, that whatever was happening now was the thing that had been building since the night at the gala, since the first kiss, and the silver-gray eyes, and the quiet statement that she'd made a dangerous choice. The thing had arrived. He lowered the phone. Vittorio's lawyers contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office 20 minutes ago, he said. His voice was completely even. He's requesting a cooperation agreement. She held his gaze. It's over, he said. She looked at him, at the lines of his face and the exhaustion in it, and the thing beneath the exhaustion that she could now read without difficulty. The thing that had been there since the beginning, patient and contained and never once performed. No, she said. He looked at her. It's starting, she said. And outside the city of New York, loud and indifferent and magnificent and entirely unaware of what had just been decided inside it, continued its permanent, beautiful, unstoppable roar into the dark before dawn. The sun came up over Queens at 6:17 a.m., and it did not look like anything in particular. It looked like a Tuesday morning in late October, which was what it was. Gray light flattening the industrial skyline, a garbage truck somewhere on the next block, the smell of exhaust and cold air, and the specific mineral quality of a city coming back to itself after the night. Evelyn stood outside the warehouse and watched it happen. Daniel had been taken to a hospital 3 blocks from Lucien's building. The cut above his eye needed stitches, and there was bruising along his ribs that the paramedics who arrived at the warehouse had wanted, looked at properly. He had argued against the hospital with the specific stubbornness of a doctor who knew exactly what his injuries were and had opinions about their severity, and Lucian had looked at him for approximately 4 seconds and said, "You're going in," the voice that ended arguments, and Daniel had gone. Lucian had not gone with him. He'd watched the ambulance leave and then stood in the street for a moment with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it did when he was processing something he wasn't going to say yet, and then he'd turned to Evelyn and said very quietly, "I need an hour." She'd nodded. Thomas had taken her back to the Tribeca building. She sat in Lucian's kitchen in the early morning light and drank coffee that Priya made and did not talk. And Priya, who had woken up on the couch to find the apartment changed in a way she could feel rather than see, made coffee and did not ask questions. And both of them watched the city grow lighter in the windows and understood, each in her own way, that the particular night they'd just come through was the kind that divided time into before and after. Lucien came back at 7:45. He looked like what he was, a man who had not slept in 30 hours, who had spent those hours dismantling the architecture of his entire life and finding his brother on a warehouse floor in Queens. He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee without speaking and drank half of it standing at the counter and then looked at Evelyn. Priya took her coffee to the living room. He sat down across from Evelyn at the kitchen island. The morning light did not flatter the exhaustion on his face. She was glad of that, of the realness of it, the absence of any version of him that was managed or performed. This was what he looked like when everything else had been taken off. "Reyes wants me in her office at 10, he said. "I know. She called me too." He raised his eyes slightly. "She wanted to verify my account of the call with Vittorio's representative last night. I told her I'd come in." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was getting louder, the specific gradual crescendo of a weekday morning filling up with itself. "Reyes is going to want to formalize everything, the timeline of the cooperation, the disclosures, my testimony." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The process is going to be long, 18 months, maybe more. There will be hearings, there will be things in the public record that aren't comfortable. I understand that. I'm not asking you to be part of it." She looked at him. "What are you asking?" He set the coffee cup down, looked at it, then at her. "I'm asking whether you intend to stay." She held his gaze. The question was asked plainly, without strategy, not the carefully worded thing it might have been from a different man, not a performance of vulnerability designed to produce a particular response. It was simply what it was, a man asking a woman whether she was going to be there when the thing he'd started became the thing it cost. "Lucien," she said, "I was in a car in Connecticut when your federal attorney called me to tell me you were accelerating the disclosure. I could have stayed in Connecticut. I came back." He was quiet. "I was standing in your conference room when Gavril told us about Daniel. I could have gone home. I stayed." "Evelyn, I answered a phone call from a man working for Vittorio D'Angelo at 2 in the morning and told him the leverage was gone." She paused. "I wasn't confused about what I was doing. I wasn't confused about what any of it was. So when you ask me if I intend to stay, you're asking me something you already know the answer to. And I think you're asking it because some part of you is still waiting for the moment I realize what I've agreed to and decide it's too much." He looked at her for a long moment. "That part," she said, "can stop waiting." Something in his face, not the demolished building composure of the conference room, not the controlled density of his professional self, but something older and more fundamental, something she thought might have been waiting a very long time for exactly these words in exactly this order, finally, quietly, let go. He reached across the counter and took her hand. Both of them. The way he had in the conference room the night before, and it was different this time. Not urgency, not the need for proof of presence. Just holding. The plain, uncomplicated act of it. "Okay," he said. She breathed. "Okay," she said back. The U.S. Attorney's Office on the 23rd floor of a federal building in Lower Manhattan was everything Evelyn's world was not. Fluorescent, functional, furniture chosen for durability rather than aesthetics. The kind of space that communicated the work is the only thing that matters here by the complete absence of anything that didn't serve the work. Sandra Reyes was 53 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular, unflinching directness of someone who had spent 20 years in federal prosecution and had run out of patience for anything that wasted her time. She shook Evelyn's hand once, firmly, looked at her with the assessment of a woman who had evaluated a great many people quickly and rarely got it wrong, and said, "You talked him down from going to get his brother himself." "I gave him a better option," Evelyn said. Reyes almost smiled. "Sit down." The meeting lasted 4 hours and covered ground that Evelyn had not fully anticipated. Her account of the conversation with Vittorio's representative, the timeline of her involvement with Lucian, what she had and hadn't known and when. She answered every question without hedging. Reyes asked them without ornament. At 2 points, Lucian's attorney, a severe woman named Margolis who had arrived at the building before any of them, and drank black coffee with the focused intensity of someone using it as fuel for an endurance event, interposed herself. At both points, Evelyn answered anyway. Lucien, sitting 2 chairs from her, watched this with something in his expression that she caught once from the corner of her eye and classified as, "He will think about this for a long time." At the end of the meeting, Reyes put down her pen and looked at both of them. "The cooperation agreement is intact," she said. "The secondary ledger copies Hale took were redundant to our existing case. Vittorio's lawyers understand this now, which is why they reached out last night." She paused. "Vittorio's cooperation terms are still being negotiated. His exposure is significant. His attorneys are going to try to use Daniel's cooperation as leverage for Vittorio's own terms, which is going to complicate things for approximately the next—" She looked at the ceiling briefly. 18 months. "I understand," Lucian said. "The public phase of this begins when the first indictments are unsealed," Reyes said. "That will happen within 60 days. When it does, the press will have the Moretti name for approximately 6 weeks before anything else. I'd advise you to have a strategy." She looked at Evelyn when she said this. Evelyn looked back. "I'm not a PR firm." "No," Reyes agreed. "But you're the person in this room who understands how narratives get built before the facts arrive. So," she picked up her pen again, "advise accordingly." The 60 days before the first indictments were the strangest and most clarifying of Evelyn's life. She kept working. Vale and Associates ran 4 events in November, 2 in early December, and the work was still the work. The peonies and the lighting and the string quartets and the impossible standards she held herself to, and the specific, focused pleasure of building something beautiful under pressure. She still color-coded her anxieties into spreadsheets. She still didn't miss deadlines. She still woke at 6 and made her coffee, and stood at her window and watched the city get started. The difference was that Marcus in the gray Volvo was still on her block, and she knew 2 more of Lucian's people by name now. And there was a protocol she ran through twice a week with Gavril that she had initially resented and now found oddly comforting, the way you find comforting anything that confirms you are being paid attention to. The difference was that twice a week she ate dinner in a Tribeca apartment or a hidden underground restaurant, or once, a terrible pizza place in the Bronx that Lucian had apparently been going to since he was 19 and that she'd found inexplicably perfect. And across those tables she talked to a man who said true things and asked real questions and never once made her feel like she was performing the correct version of herself. The difference was that she slept. She had stopped examining why and simply accepted it as evidence. Daniel was released from the hospital after 2 days and went back to work at his clinic on the 3rd day, which Lucian found out about from one of his people, and which Evelyn, when he told her, recognized as the exact kind of thing a doctor who was also a Moretti would do, and which she thought, privately, was probably the right instinct. The conversation between the brothers happened on a Sunday in mid-November, in Lucian's apartment. Evelyn was not there for it. She'd understood without being asked that this was private, not because Lucian would have excluded her, but because some things needed to happen in the absence of audience, in the specific privacy of 2 people who have known each other their entire lives and are trying to find out if the structure of that knowledge is still intact. She went to her own apartment and worked on a proposal, and made pasta, and did not call. Lucien called at 9 p.m. "How is he?" she asked. A pause. "Alive," he said. "Present." Another pause. "He told me he's been afraid I would become my father for 15 years. He told me the federal cooperation was the only way he could think of to make it impossible. He told me he's sorry." She was quiet. "I told him I've known I wasn't my father for about 6 years," Lucian said, "and that it would have helped to hear that he believed it." She waited. "He didn't know I was already trying," Lucian said. "I didn't tell him clearly enough. I thought the work spoke for itself, that he could see it." His voice was even, but with the specific weight of someone who has said a hard thing out loud for the first time and is listening to what it sounds like. He couldn't see what he couldn't see, and I don't show things. I know that about myself. I've always thought it was useful, and it has been in most contexts, he stopped. It cost you your brother's trust, she said. Yes. She looked at the wall of her apartment. Is it fixable? He was quiet long enough that she added it up herself. The damage, and the years, and the specific weight of being loved badly by someone who meant well. And she thought she already knew the answer. Yes, he said. Not quickly, not with false certainty, with the measured weight of a man who has made a calculation and is committing to it. It's fixable. It's going to take longer than I want it to and be harder than it should be. And we're going to have to rebuild something from a foundation I didn't know was cracked. A pause. But he's my brother, and I'm not going to lose him over something that can be fixed. She thought about that, about the particular stubbornness of it, the refusal to call the damage irreparable because irreparable was a word he'd decided didn't apply. Good, she said. The first indictments were unsealed on a Wednesday morning in January, and the press was everything Reyes had predicted and nothing Evelyn was surprised by. The Moretti name ran on every major outlet for 6 days. Photographs of the building in Tribeca. Photographs of Lucien at various events over the years, in rooms she recognized, at galas she had designed. 2 photographs of her. She had prepared for the photographs. She looked at them once, assessed them the way she assessed everything, objectively, for what they communicated and what they didn't, and then put them away and went to work. Priya fielded 23 media inquiries in the first 2 days. She handled all of them with 3 words. No comment, thanks. On the 3rd day, she appeared in Evelyn's office doorway with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to own it. I'd like a raise, Priya said. Evelyn looked at her. At the past 4 months of her assistant's behavior, the non-questions, the seamless competence, the I'll get the car in a Connecticut driveway when the sensible choice was to stay. 20%, she said. Priya nodded. Left. The 7th day, the press moved to the next story. The indictments were real, but they were complex, and complexity is expensive to sustain in the news cycle, and by the following Monday the city had found something else to consume. What remained was the legal process, slower, less legible, far more consequential. Evelyn had built a narrative in the weeks before the indictments, the way Reyes had suggested. Not for the press, for the institutions, the foundation boards, the charitable partners, the legitimate business relationships that needed to understand what was happening before they read it in a headline. She'd written briefings, held private calls, coordinated with Margolis on the legal framing and with Lucian's communications team on the tone. She had done it the way she did everything, with precision and no wasted motion and the specific, focused clarity of someone who understood that the story you told first was the one people used to interpret every story that came after. Lucien had watched her do it. He hadn't commented, but there was something in his face across those weeks. Not surprise, not quite admiration, something more specific and more private than either, that told her he was understanding, concretely and for the first time, what it actually meant to have a person who was fully present, not supporting, not managing, present, on. The legal process took 22 months. She had thought she understood long before it ended what 22 months would contain. Hearings and filings and deposition preparations, and the specific grinding tedium of institutional machinery moving at institutional speed. But the reality of it was something that could not be fully anticipated from the outside. There were weeks that required Lucian's complete attention, weeks that left him flat-eyed with exhaustion, weeks where the process uncovered things that were not in any document she'd read, and that required her to sit across from him in the late evenings and absorb the cost of them in real time. She did not always handle it well. There was a night in March of the 2nd year, 8 months into the legal process, 14 months into what they were to each other, which did not have a clean name and did not need one. When she came home from a 16-hour event day to find 3 of Lucian's people in her building lobby and a car outside she didn't recognize, and something in her, the accumulated weight of the months, the constant low-level management of exposure and protocol, and the specific exhaustion of living in a world where every ordinary movement required a calculation, simply gave out. She walked past Lucien's people and went upstairs and called him and said, without preamble, "I need a week." He was quiet. "Not, I need a week from you," she said. I need a week from this. From the protocols and the people in my lobby and the... I need to go somewhere and work and not calculate anything. Okay, he said. She stopped. That's it? Where do you want to go? She hadn't thought that far. I don't know, somewhere quiet. The house in Maine has been empty since September. The Volvos don't come up there. She closed her eyes. I'm not asking you to... I know you're not, he said. Thomas can have you there by midnight if you leave in the next hour. She went to Maine. It was a house on a rocky coast outside a town small enough that no one cared about the name attached to it. The ocean was gray and loud and completely indifferent in the way that only large bodies of water and the city of New York actually achieved. She worked for 3 days on proposal briefs and vendor contracts and the production timeline for a spring gala that needed her full attention. And she ran every morning on the coastal path even though it was cold, and she cooked simple things and ate them alone and slept 9 hours a night. On the 4th day, she called Lucian. I'm not apologizing, she said. I didn't ask you to. I needed to say it out loud anyway. She was sitting on the back step of the house with coffee, looking at the ocean. This isn't... The life of it is harder than I knew it would be. I understood the danger. I underestimated the maintenance. The maintenance, he said. The constant management of being adjacent to something this large. The protocols and the people and the... She stopped. I'm not leaving. I want you to know that. I'm telling you this so you understand it's real and not something I'm performing past. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? I think I need it to be ours and not just yours, she said. I think the part that's hard is when it feels like I've moved into the orbit of something that already existed rather than... She stopped again, tried to find the precise word. Rather than something we're building together. Tell me what that looks like practically, he said. She had thought about this for 4 days. I want to know about things before they're decided. Not to approve them, not to manage them. I want to be in the room. She paused. I want you to tell me when something is costing you something, not after, not in retrospect, but while it's happening. I know that's not how you're built. I'm asking you to rebuild it. Silence. Longer than usual. That's going to be harder than anything else you've asked me for, he said. I know. I'll try, he said. That's honest. It's not a promise of success. It's a commitment to try. I know the difference, she said. I know you do. She looked at the ocean. The waves came in with the indifferent regularity of something that didn't need to be managed. Come up Thursday, she said. Thursday, he said. He came up Thursday. They found, across those 22 months, a version of things that worked. Not seamlessly, she would have been suspicious of seamless, would have recognized it as performance rather than reality. What they found was functional and honest, and sometimes hard and regularly worth it, which was the description she privately considered the only reasonable standard for anything she wanted to keep. He got better at telling her things while they were happening. Not fully, not overnight, not without periodic reversions to the contained silence that was his default setting. But better. She could see the effort of it, the specific, deliberate quality of a man rewiring something structural, and she found that the effort itself was part of what she needed to see, not the result alone. The trying. She got better at naming when she was exhausted, which had always been harder for her than it should have been, because naming exhaustion meant admitting limitation, and admitting limitation had, for most of her adult life, felt like the beginning of being left. She learned, slowly and with evidence, that naming it to this particular person produced the opposite result. Not distance, but the specific, uncomplicated presence of someone who had been asked to stay and intended to. The main house became a thing they returned to, not scheduled, just available, understood, the way a fixed point is understood. Daniel Moretti came back into the full picture gradually, the way fractures heal, not cleanly, not all at once, but in the incremental, unremarkable accumulation of repaired small things. He and Lucien had dinner twice in the first month after the Queen's warehouse, and Evelyn did not attend. They had dinner twice in the second month, and she did. The conversation was careful in the way of people navigating newly mapped territory, and she watched the two of them across a restaurant table and thought about what it took to choose repair over the simpler architecture of grievance. She liked Daniel. She had not been certain she would, had been prepared to find him difficult, or righteous, or carrying the specific moral exhaustion of someone who had done a hard thing for good reasons and needed the reasons validated repeatedly. He was none of those things. He was tired like his brother, and honest like his brother, and had a sense of humor that arrived unexpectedly and was funnier than it had any right to be. He told her once, over bad pizza at the Bronx place, that she was the reason Lucien had not tried to handle the Queen situation himself. She looked at him. He would have made the same choice without me. Maybe, Daniel said, but maybe means I don't know, and I know I don't know. He looked at his pizza. He doesn't ask for things from people. He never has. He provides. He arranges. He makes things work. He looked up. He asked you to come with him to Queens. She remembered it. The look across the kitchen. The request, unguarded, stripped of the management that usually surrounded everything he did. Yes, she said. That's... Daniel considered. That's not a thing he would have done with anyone else. I want you to know I understand what that means. She looked at him. At the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the cut above his eyebrow still pink with recent healing. He loves you, she said. He didn't know how to show you he'd changed because he thought the change was visible in what he was doing. He thought you could see it. Daniel was quiet. He's not good at announcing himself, she said. You probably know that. But it means sometimes the most important things he's doing are the ones he hasn't said out loud yet. She paused. He needs you to ask. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the specific gravity of a man receiving information he would carry carefully. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said. Just ask him. Vittorio D'Angelo's cooperation agreement was finalized 14 months into the legal process. He received a reduced sentence in exchange for full testimony, 17 years, with eligibility for review at 12. His legal team issued a statement that his attorneys had written and that contained nothing resembling the man she'd sat across from in a marble table cafe. She read it once and filed it and did not think about him again. Connor Hale pled guilty to federal charges of conspiracy and obstruction 18 months in. He received 8 years. She read that once too and felt nothing particular. Not satisfaction. Not relief. The specific quiet neutrality of an account that has been settled without anyone coming out ahead. Ray Brennan, the city councilman, resigned from 3 foundation boards and from office, citing personal reasons, which was the language people used when the alternative to voluntary departure was involuntary. She had helped draft the language that allowed the Kellerman Foundation to accept his resignation without triggering a public inquiry, which had required the most careful 4 paragraphs she'd ever written. She was proud of those 4 paragraphs in the specific, private way. She was proud of work that solved a hard problem invisibly. The last federal hearing concluded on a Thursday morning in early spring, 3.5 years after a woman at a charity gala grabbed a man by the collar and kissed him in front of half the city. Evelyn sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Lucien give his final testimony with the same contained, deliberate quality. He gave everything, and she watched the judge receive it, and she watched the attorneys make their final arguments, and she watched the thing that had been building for 3 years, the slow, grinding, expensive, unglamorous process of a man choosing to dismantle the thing he'd inherited rather than become it, arrive at its conclusion. The federal clearance was issued 31 days later. She was not in the building for the press conference. She'd suggested holding it at the Kellerman Foundation's headquarters rather than the Moretti Group offices because the foundation was the cleanest piece of the legitimate architecture and putting the announcement there framed the story correctly. Lucien had agreed without argument, which she'd noted was itself a measure of how far they'd come, not because he'd needed convincing, but because he'd used to make those decisions alone. She stood at the back of the room and watched him at the podium and thought about the list of things that had happened between a charity gala in September and this particular Thursday in spring, and the list was long and the cost of it was real, and she did not sanitize either of those things in her accounting. She thought about 3 seconds, about a bad decision that turned out to be the most important thing she'd ever done, about the specific, irreducible truth that the line between reckless and brave was a line you only understood from the other side of it. The cameras flashed. The journalists asked their questions. The politicians applauded the way politicians applaud things they didn't participate in building. Lucien stood at the podium and answered questions with the flat, precise economy of his public self, and then his eyes moved across the room and found her in the back without searching, which meant he'd known where she was the whole time, which she found she still noticed after all these years and still felt in the same place. She gave him the smallest nod. The kind that said, "You survived it. We survived it." He held her eyes for 2 seconds. Then he looked back at the journalist in the front row. The hallway was quiet when he found her. Late afternoon light through tall windows, the kind of light that had made up its mind about the day and was settling in for the last of it. No security in the immediate corridor. She could hear them nearby, the ambient presence that had become part of the architecture of her life, but not visible, not intrusive. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her, and she thought about the first time she'd seen him from across a room, the stillness of him, the quality of attention that operated differently from anyone else she'd known. And she thought about how much she'd learned to read in that stillness since, and about how the reading of it had become one of the things she valued most in her daily life, which was not something she'd expected to be able to say about anything. He crossed the hallway, stopped in front of her. She looked at his face, the lines of it, the jaw that had healed slightly off from an old break, the silver-gray eyes that had looked at worse things than her and had not flinched and had, somewhere in the last 3.5 years, learned to let her look back. He reached up and cupped her face in both his hands the way he sometimes did, with the specific, unhurried care of a man still faintly amazed by something he no longer had to be afraid of losing. "You stayed," he said. She felt her eyes go warm. Not tears, quite. The precursor to them. She didn't stop it. "So did you," she said. He breathed. She felt it, the quality of it, the depth, the specific exhale of a man who has been holding something in for a very long time and has just finally set it down. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I was going to do it regardless," he said. The disclosure, the federal cooperation, the entire process. "I was going to do it regardless of what Vittorio threatened, regardless of what Hale took, regardless of what Daniel did. I want you to know that. I want you to know it wasn't you that made me choose it." She looked at him. "I know that. I know you know it. I'm telling you because—" He paused, assembling the words with the deliberateness he used for things that mattered. "Because you asked me once, very early, to give you the actual truth. And the actual truth is that I would have gotten there. Slower, harder, maybe messier. But I would have gotten there." He looked at her. "What you gave me was not the direction. I already knew the direction. You gave me someone to get there with," she said quietly. I was still for a moment. "Yes," he said. She put her hands over his where they held her face, felt the steadiness of them, the specific, uncomplicated warmth of hands that had spent 3.5 years choosing, in every small and large way, to be careful with the things they held. "Lucienne," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something too." He waited, his full attention, all of it. "I came to New York when I was 22, she said, "with a plan for my life that was extremely detailed and left no room in it for anything I hadn't accounted for. And every time something arrived that I hadn't planned for, I shrank the plan. I made the life smaller so the unplanned things couldn't reach it." She looked at him. "I kissed you because I was afraid of being humiliated in front of a room full of people. That was the whole reason. There was nothing brave about it." She paused. "But staying, every time I chose to stay, that was mine. That was the bravest thing I've ever done, choosing something I didn't have control over. And I want you to know that I don't regret a single, not one piece of it. Not the card on the desk, not Connecticut, not Queens, not the 22 months of federal proceedings, not one piece." I was looking at her with an expression she had learned to read by now, the thing underneath the stillness, the thing that had been there since approximately the second week, but had taken much longer to surface completely. The thing that looked, when it arrived fully to the surface, like a man recognizing something he had not believed he was allowed to have. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't make it formal. Just—" She stepped into him, closed the 3 inches between them, and leaned her forehead against his chest. Felt his arms come around her, felt the steady, slow rhythm of him breathing. "Just this," she said, "just for a minute." He held her. No performance of it, no management, just his arms and his heartbeat, and the late afternoon light coming through the windows of a hallway in a city that had been, for both of them, the site of the most important demolition and construction of their lives. Outside, Manhattan continued its permanent, magnificent noise, the horns and the sirens, and the indifferent roar of 8 million people living their lives at full speed, none of whom had any idea what had just concluded in a federal courtroom and a quiet hallway and the long private accumulation of 1,000 small choices made by two specific people over 3.5 years. It didn't need to know. The city was a backdrop. It always had been. The story had never been about the city. She listened to his heartbeat, steady, real, present. "What happens now?" she said, into his chest. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him think about it, genuinely, without the prepared answer, in the specific way he thought about things when he wasn't managing them. "Now," he said, "we build something." She lifted her head, looked at him. What kind of something? The almost smile arrived. She had seen it hundreds of times now, and it still did the same thing to her, which she had decided was information rather than weakness. "The kind we decide on," he said, "together, with no criminal infrastructure and full federal clearance and—" He paused. "With significantly better than even odds." She looked at him. At the face that had become, over 3.5 years of impossible conditions, the most familiar landscape in her life. At the silver-gray eyes that had looked at her from the beginning like she was worth being careful with. She smiled. Not the professional one. Not the composed, controlled expression she'd worn as armor for most of her adult life. The actual one. The one that arrived without permission and said simply that she was in the presence of something real, significantly better than even odds, she said. "I can work with that." She took his hand. They walked back toward the sound of the city together, through the late afternoon light, with nothing resolved perfectly and everything that mattered intact, and the future ahead of them open and undesigned in theirs. For the first time in either of their lives, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The end. Thank you for following the story to this very last line. If Evelyn and Lucien have touched something in you, please like and comment your city name below, so I know how far this story has come.